So when Pastor Matt asked me about sharing today, one of the things that went through my mind was all the different ways you can approach the Christmas story. You know, there are just hundreds of ways. There's a song that talks about all the different ways that children see Jesus. Some see him lily white, the baby Jesus born this night. Some children see him lily white with tresses soft and fair. Some children see him bronzed and brown, the Lord of heaven to earth come down. Some children see him bronzed and brown with dark and wavy hair. Some see him almond-eyed. Some see him dark as they, and so on. The children each see a different place. We'll see the baby Jesus' face, like theirs, but bright with heavenly grace and filled with holy light. Oh, lay aside each earthly thing, and with thy heart as offering, come worship now the infant King. 'Tis love that's born tonight. There's a lot of different ways to look at the story of Jesus, and I thought, well, let's just do them all. So I thought, well, let's just do them all. Yes? Well, we can't really do that. But we can ask the question, who is this Jesus that was born? And you know that the Gospels provide for us different ways of looking at Jesus. How many of you know that there are 4 Gospels? Let's try that again. How many of you know that there are 4 Gospels? Okay, thank you. That's a little better. I appreciate that very much. And that these 4 Gospels present Jesus in 4 different ways. And so it's helpful for us as we seek to understand the Christmas story, I think, to see it from the perspective of the different gospel writers. And so it's helpful to proceed in that direction. I'm going to talk this morning about Christmas according to the Gospels. And we want to begin with the Gospel of Mark. What's really interesting about Mark, when you read it, is that there's no birth account at all. Here's a gospel about Jesus, and it begins this way. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And so when you come to the story of Jesus in the Gospel of John, his birth is not ever mentioned. Instead, we just have these words that are provided for us. And so this man, Mark, writes an account of Jesus that doesn't include anything about his birth. It starts with the ministry of John and then goes right into Jesus' ministry. And so what we find is that the date of Christmas is uncertain. The most precise statements that we have are Luke chapter 5, verse 1, that says to us, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zacharias, and it goes on to tell the story of Zacharias. So that gives us a little bit of framework. And then Luke tells us in Luke chapter 2, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the census was to be taken, and this was the first census while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. So what we have are general parameters for the birth of Jesus, but no date. The birthday is uncertain. Probably you knew that we do not know that that Jesus' birth is the 25th. We just picked the day. We don't even know that December is the month of Jesus' birth. There are those who would argue that shepherds would not have been out in the fields with their sheep in December. But then we are in the land of Israel, and the climates are very different from here. And we don't even know the year in which Jesus was born. And so it strikes me as very interesting that as we begin the story of Jesus, we do not know when actually he was born. We know that he was born sometime between 6 BC and 2 AD. But that's a pretty big window, isn't it? And so what's really interesting is that the second most important event in all of human history has no date. We do not know. So why do you suppose there's no date? And why do you suppose that when Mark writes his gospel, that he doesn't bother giving us any details about Jesus' birth. What we have is Mark as a servant, presenting Jesus as a servant. It says in Acts chapter 13, you remember the story of the first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas were traveling, and they had with them, it says, John Mark, and he was their helper. The word helper is under rower or understudy. The word helper here is like a person who prepares for various parts in a play, but is not really on the playbill, not really a part of it. That person is there to step in case something needs to be done. That's what Mark was. And so God chose Mark to write a gospel about Jesus as a servant. The key verse in Mark's gospel is this verse in 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So when Mark writes about Jesus, he writes from the perspective of a servant, and he describes Jesus as the servant of God. And so what we find is that a servant's lineage is not important. Where a servant comes from doesn't really matter. The parentage is not particularly important when it comes to a servant. It's kind of like a waitress or a mail carrier. When the waitress comes to your table, if you go to breakfast or lunch after the service today and you sit down in the restaurant, the waitress comes to your table, you don't ask her, well, who are your parents, right? You don't say, where did you go to school, right? Did you graduate from college? Are you prepared? Are you equipped to be my waitress? You want one thing when she comes to the table, which is service, right? And you want it now. How many of you know the birthday of your mail carrier? One person, because her mail carrier is her husband. I never got that answer before, Shannon. Thank you. That's terrific. But we don't know those kinds of details about the people who wait on us, who take care of us. And when Mark writes the gospel of Jesus as a servant, he is not particularly interested in those kinds of details. And so Mark is focused on the serving, and he presents Jesus as being focused on that serving as well, right? And when you study this, serving trumps recognition. It's not about being recognized. And that's where we get the things turned upside down sometimes. We agree to serve in some capacity, and then we want people to say, see, she's serving. See, here's what he's doing. Jesus was not like that. He was a humble servant, not focused on the recognition. As a matter of fact, what we read often is that when Jesus was involved in discussions and so forth, and the discussion got a little bit heated, he walked away. Observe the pattern in the Gospels. He would come into town, he would heal some people, he would gain a hearing, he would start to teach, and the religious leaders would show up and they would challenge him. He would answer their challenges and then turn around and walk away, and he went to other places. Because it was not about proving who he was. It was about being God's servant to God's people. So Jesus says to his disciples, to you and me as well, in Luke 17, so you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, we are only unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done. That's to be the mentality. And that was Jesus' mentality. He's not unkind. He's not without compassion. But he is not focused on himself. His mission is clearly in mind. He is focused on where he's going. but it's not about exalting himself. And so you have this beautiful picture of a servant. Here's the summation of the Gospel of Mark. It's also basically the outline of the gospel if you're interested. 1 through 10, Jesus came to serve, and 11 through 16, Jesus came to save. So, Mark is about Jesus as a servant. Now, from there we go to Luke. And it's a very different story with Luke, isn't it? When you come to the Gospel of Luke, what we have is the most detailed presentation of the birth of Jesus, just exactly the opposite. In Luke chapter 2, these verses are part of that birth record that Mary, when her time came to be delivered, gave birth to a child and wrapped him and laid him in a manger. So Jesus' birth is described in great detail in the Gospel of Luke. As a matter of fact, 2 full chapters of the longest New Testament book. I don't know if you knew that. Luke is the longest New Testament book. It's slightly longer than Acts and longer than all the rest of the epistles. And Luke wrote the largest single portion of the New Testament. When you put Luke and Acts together, it's 27.5% of the New Testament, if you're interested. The engineers here would be interested in that sort of thing. So 2 full chapters going into the detail about Jesus and his birth. It's really fascinating. There are 7 movements to Mark's account of Jesus' birth. Here they are, the 7 movements, okay, starting in chapter 1, verse 1, and you move down through the first 2 chapters. And it's very interesting, the information that's presented as Luke gives to us this account. We are often most interested in the actual birth record itself, Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 20. And that we read this with great delight and with great joy as Luke presents for us this story of Jesus. Now, Luke gives to us the most personal details of the birth of Jesus. For example, we have a genealogy. Not in those 2 chapters, by the way. It's actually in chapter 3. And he starts with Joseph and goes backwards all the way to Adam. So that tells us something, especially when you compare it with the genealogy from Matthew. Jesus' genealogy goes from Joseph all the way back to Adam, as Luke provides that for us. Secondly, we have the details of Gabriel's visits, right? Gabriel comes to visit Zacharias. We've been studying that in our classics in the mornings here. And then Gabriel comes to Mary in those precious moments when he presents to her the fact that she is going to be with child. And he says to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High." And so you have the details of this very personal interaction between Gabriel and Mary as Gabriel presents that. We have the travel to Bethlehem. And so we sometimes see that story portrayed in the movies or on TV or whatever as they go from Bethlehem in the last days of Mary's pregnancy, from Nazareth in the last days of her pregnancy down to Bethlehem, arriving apparently just in time for her to give birth in the inn, and there was no place for them to stay. And then we have the story of the angels as they make this announcement and as they come and share with the shepherds. We wouldn't know anything about that except for Luke's account. And then Luke even includes the story of Jesus' circumcision. And 33 days later, of Mary and Joseph going up to Jerusalem to present the offerings that were necessary for her purification. The Old Testament was very specific. And so Luke gives us all these personal details. Exactly the opposite of Mark, right? And so he's presenting the story of Jesus, and he presents the story, and you see the personal elements like this from Mary, as she just exalts the Lord for God's selection of her as an individual. And it highlights the fact that Luke is focused on human beings. Luke is focused on humanity. And I love these verses from Psalm 139, where we read David's words, I will praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And that story reverberates through Zacharias and Elizabeth and the timing that's involved, through Mary and her selection as a young, godly woman who is chosen by God to be the mother of his son, of the events that take place and all of these things, so that we're focusing on the personal details, the personal aspects of the story. And so what we have is Jesus' humanity presented. Mark focuses on Jesus as a servant. Luke focuses on Jesus as a man. What's interesting is you may know that Luke is a medical doctor. And so it's a medical doctor who is tapped on the shoulder by the Lord and said, I want you to write these details about my son. I want you to show his humanity. I want you to show how he became one with the people that he came to redeem. And all of these things, as he fulfills all the aspects of the law, as he is subject to his parents, as he learns to live and so forth in order to prepare for the mission that God has given to him. Emphasis here is on his humanity. For example, the one detail that Luke presents that nobody else presents is when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane that night. And he says when he was praying that night, it was so intense that his sweat became like drops of blood. Again, human elements. One of the things I love about Luke's gospel is all the references to the ladies who were a part of Jesus' ministry. In Luke chapter 8, he says there were a number of women who traveled with the disciples and Jesus, and they paved the way. Out of their funds, they provided for the ministry. No other person does that. See, Luke is focused on the humanity, and he presents Jesus as the quintessential man. He is a man among men. He is a real man. And that's how Luke presents this as he shares this with us. So the Gospel of Luke is summarized in many ways, I think, by Luke chapter 19, verse 10. The Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. And so we find this is true for Luke. Before we move from that, I want to just highlight the fact that what is communicated in the story in many ways is that human lives are divinely created, divinely purposed, and divinely ordained. Every one of us is a divine creation. You were made to be who you are in the womb of your mother, and your genes and all of the equipment and all of the aspects of who you are were given to you. Now, there are a lot of things you've learned along the way, some good, some bad, right? Some things have to be unlearned and other things have to be learned. But you were equipped by God in the womb, just as Jesus was, just as Mary was, just as Zacharias and Elizabeth and all of these other persons who were part of the Christmas story. And so there's an application that comes at this point as you think about the different stages of life. As Mary has this announcement made to her as they take the baby into the temple after he's born, as Jesus grows up in the home. And that's this. It's not a parent's responsibility to have godly children. It's a parent's responsibility to make sure their children have godly parents. So it's our responsibility to be the men and women of God who will be used by God in the lives of our children. And God calls Mary and Joseph, and he calls Zacharias and Elizabeth to accomplish this in the lives of his servants. So Luke presents Jesus as a man. Mark presents him as a servant. That leads us then to Matthew. And you probably can figure out where I'm going by this point in the account. But in the Matthew account, Jesus' birth is not really described either. So we're back now to more like Mark in some ways. What we find, Matthew begins this way. The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and then down through. And finally he comes down to Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and so on. And so what we have is a different genealogy. Luke's genealogy, remember I mentioned, starts at Joseph and goes backwards to Adam. In Matthew, we have a royal genealogy. It starts with David. And David is placed before Abraham in the account to highlight the fact that we're talking about a royal genealogy. We're talking about presenting the one who came to be the King of the Jews. And so in this picture, we then have Gabriel coming to Joseph. And remember, Joseph was going to divorce Mary. They were already legally bound together, but had not yet come together in marriage. And Joseph finds out that she's going to have a baby, and so he begins to make preparations. He spends quite a bit of time, apparently. The text says when he had contemplated, when he had worked it all through and decided what was the best way to go, Gabriel comes to him and says, "Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit." And so God now taps Joseph on the shoulder, just like Gabriel had tapped Mary on the shoulder. Now Gabriel comes and taps Joseph on the shoulder and says, "I want you to follow through on this." And so what we have now in the Gospel of Matthew is the first Christian apologetic. Matthew presents the royal Davidic lineage and the claim of Jesus to be the King of the Jews. The other Gospels mention it too, but that's particularly Matthew's bent as he presents Jesus as the King. And he protects the sanctity of his birth. Do you remember in the Gospel of John later on in Jesus' ministry, some people will say to him, "We know who our father was," right? And so there were people who were going around saying that he can't be the King of the Jews because of this illegitimate birth and all of these things that had happened and so forth. And Matthew is writing to protect that and to preserve the integrity of those things. It is most likely the earliest New Testament book to be written, possible exception of James. And the reason that is the case is because all of the early Christians were Jews, right? In the first couple of years, every single believer was Jewish. Now, if you lived in Jerusalem and you became a believer in Jesus and you wanted to take a Christmas tract to the neighbor next door, right? You will pick them up after the service. If you were going to take a Christmas tract to the neighbor next door, the person's going to say to you, "How do you know that this Jesus is the King? And if he is, what happened? What happened? Because Jesus is dead and gone." Now, we know he's dead, buried, raised, and gone. But they don't know that. And so Matthew would be the earliest needed epistle. And it's written to answer the question about Jesus being the King of the Jews. And so what you have is this statement protecting the integrity of his birth, so that what Matthew is saying is not only is Jesus a legitimate pretender to the throne, but he is also the Son of God. And so Matthew takes this all the way down as he presents Jesus. And so some folks a few years ago wrote a song in a Christmas carol entitled, "How Should a King Come?" How should a king come? What should it look like when a king comes? And that's what Matthew is presenting to us. So he answers these Jewish questions, and then he takes us to the presentation of the Magi. The Magi only appear in the Gospel of Matthew. none of the other Gospels. Why in Matthew? Well, where did they go? So you went to Bethlehem. No, they stopped somewhere before they went to Bethlehem, remember? The Bible tells us that they went to Jerusalem. It says, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the days of Judea, in the days of Herod, the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. So God, like he called the shepherds to the stable to observe the birth, God called these Magi from a far country to Jerusalem. And when he brought them to Jerusalem, the purpose there was for them to ask the question, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? We have seen his star, and we've come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. What God did in sending the Magi was to stir up the whole city of Jerusalem with this question, where is he who is born King of the Jews? Otherwise, there's no record for them. There's no notice to them. We have something going on in a little town called Bethlehem, and hardly anybody knows what goes on in Bethlehem. It's like, where's Steelmanville, right? There's a couple people here. That's very dear to you, I know. But so you have those kinds of things. And what we find is that Herod took it a step further. Gathering all the chief priests and the scribes, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they came and said, in Bethlehem, because it's written in the prophet Micah. It says, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So they knew where the Messiah was to be born. You know what's really interesting? There's no record of one of them checking it out. There's no record of any single one of them going to Bethlehem to check it out. But the wise men went. And the text tells us, after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshiped him. You have to understand, Jesus is between a year and 2 years old at this point. A number of things have happened when you put the Gospel of Luke in place. They had to go up to Jerusalem and offer the purification offerings and all that sort of thing. And so it's a child now, not a baby. The wise men did not come to the stable. They came to the house in Bethlehem that Mary and Joseph were occupying, and they brought these gifts and presented them to Jesus. And then we have Jesus now being presented as the king. Interesting. IRS agent, right? Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew was a government agent. He knew government records. He knew all of these kinds of things. And God taps him on the shoulder to write this gospel, the gospel of Jesus as the king. And so what we have is the royalty of Jesus defended. He's presented as the Jewish Messiah. He's presented as the Gentile Redeemer as well. All through Matthew, interestingly enough, are these references to the Gentiles being included. Because partway through, we have Jesus transitioning. When the kingdom is rejected in chapter 12, Jesus begins with the parables of the mystery kingdom in chapter 13. And so Jesus is now explaining things that are going to take place in the future. Matthew 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse talks about when the kingdom will come down in the future. And in the meantime, Jesus is currently building his church. And so in Matthew 16, he says to Peter, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. That is, that I am Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. But my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades will not overpower it. And so Jesus is about the work of building the church. This is the message that's presented to Jewish people living in and around Jerusalem in that first century. They're the people who needed this defense of Jesus. And so the gospel concludes with the Great Commission, doesn't it? Jesus says to his disciples, all authority has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. So Matthew presents Jesus as a king. By my count, that leaves one gospel, right? And that's the Gospel of John. And John's gospel is different again. Jesus' birth is not described. We don't have all the details. We have no genealogy. We have no angel visits. We have no parental descriptions. That is, we don't take any time to describe Mary or Joseph, either one of them, in terms of their qualifications and whatever. We have no shepherd's visit. We have no wise men. We have no childhood presented. None of the things that are part of the traditional Christmas story are presented in the Gospel of John. And the reason is because John is presenting Jesus in a different way. John presents the incarnation of Jesus. John approaches it differently. And so his genealogy begins this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And so John describes for us first Jesus' eternality, the fact that he existed forever in eternity past with the Father. And then he describes Jesus' equality with God. He was with God, and he was God. And he was the one who created the earth and so forth. And so he describes for us the incarnation. Incarnation, the word carna in the middle is the word flesh. So the in-flesh process is what John is describing. And so what we have is the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory. Glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. And so what we have in John's gospel is God's Son, who existed before Adam, who becomes Mary's son through the incarnation. And so the Christmas story is very different in the Gospel of John, isn't it? We read these words as Paul comments on this in Philippians. Although he existed in the form of God, the Word in eternity past, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient unto the point of death, even death on a cross. And so John shares with us how God became the man described in Luke, who was the servant described in Mark, who will one day be the king described in Matthew. A number of years ago, one hymn writer wrote these words, which I think are amazing as we describe this. Down from his glory, ever-living story, my God and Savior came, and Jesus was his name. Born in a manger, to his own a stranger, a man of sorrows, tears, and agony. What condescension, bringing us redemption, that in the dead of night, not one faint hope in sight, God, gracious, tender, laid aside his splendor, stepping to woo, to win, to save my soul. Without reluctance, flesh and blood his substance, he took the form of man, revealed the hidden plan. O glorious mystery, sacrifice of Calvary. And now I know thou art the great I am. And the chorus goes, oh, how I love him, how I adore him. My breath, my sunshine, my all in all. the great Creator, became my Savior, and all God's fullness dwelleth in him. What a beautiful, beautiful story. There's a little bit of John presents Jesus' deity. John, interestingly enough, is the first cousin of Jesus and an intellectual. He's a disciple that Jesus loves, and he describes the incarnation. Jesus came to reveal the Father. And so, for example, in John 14, we read, Jesus said to Philip, "Have I been so long with you, Philip? Yet you have not come to know me. He who has seen me has seen the Father." And he also came to redeem the world. John writes the purpose of his book. Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So here's the point, as I see it, of the four Gospels. Assuming royal humanity as a humble servant, God's eternal Son reveals the Father and redeems the lost. I always like to ask the question, so what? So what? Three things. One, you need to accept Jesus as your Savior. He's the only one who ever came qualified to die for us. We need to emulate Jesus as our example, and we need to glorify God as our Heavenly Father. And that's how we go to a whole nother level.
So if I haven't said it enough already, the doctor is in the house. Yes.